Thank you, Saburi-san. Thank you for the very kind words also about my book. Very much appreciated. This is obviously, on the one hand, this is, I think, the perfect moment to be having this discussion because I think myself and I think probably most of the people watching this and participating in this discussion, we're all trying to figure out what exactly it is to expect. But on the other hand, it's a challenging moment to do it because I think the sense of uncertainty around the second Trump administration is probably higher now than it might be at any time, and there's more room to think about possible scenarios. We're still waiting, of course, to see who's going to have all the important roles in the administration. We still don't know who the Treasury Secretary will be, for example. So there's a lot up in the air. I think we are now in a world really of imagining different, what we might call tail risks, and thinking about different possibilities, but not necessarily being in a position to identify the likelihood of any particular outcome. And so it's a challenging moment, but it's a useful moment, and it's a period of time, I think, where we can have a really fruitful discussion, really thinking through what to expect from the incoming U.S. administration and what it might mean for Japan and what Japan might want to do in response. What I think before even really thinking about scenarios or thinking about what's going to be different, I think it's worth really even starting from a position of what do we know both about Trump and what we might call the America First worldview, because ultimately I think that is what we should expect really to be different about this administration, that this is an administration that is coming in, the president-elect is going to be much more confident this time around. He's going to be surrounded by people who have had really a lot of years to articulate what Trumpism is, what a Trumpist policy should look like. They are waiting to fill important roles in the second Trump administration. And so we should expect that this is going to be different, but it's also going to be similar in an important way. And that is really, at its most basic level, you have an incoming president who really views the world and the United States' place in the world in a fundamentally different fashion than preceding administrations, both Republican and Democratic, going back to 1945. And so there really is the potential for meaningful change in how the United States engages with the world. Thinking a little more about that, Trump's view of the world, and I think we can say this with some confidence because these are things he's said really his entire life as a public figure, is that he's questioned whether it is worthwhile for the United States to pay the costs of maintaining international order, which means preserving international institutions, building multilateral and bilateral security alliances to prevent the outbreak of conflict, promoting global economic integration, upholding global norms, and so on, to ensure that the U.S. and its partners can prosper together. Of course, there have been plenty of U.S. administrations that have acted unilaterally, that have acted selfishly, that have questioned whether allies were taking advantage of the United States. Trump goes, I think, further than any of his predecessors in opposing the idea, basically the internationalism, the bipartisan internationalism that was the basis for U.S. foreign policy going back to 1945. And I think what we could say, he's really opposed to the idea of positive sum cooperation, that the U.S. can really bear the costs and it will benefit other countries, but the U.S. will also benefit from that. I think he is fundamentally opposed to that. I think the essence of Trump's worldview really is that relations with the world are zero sum, that if other countries gain, if they run trade surpluses with the United States or if they receive one-sided security guarantees from the United States, then the United States loses. And so I think we can say from Trump's, really the entire history of his comments on U.S. foreign policy, that he views essentially U.S. foreign policy going back to 1945 as a series of bad deals, a series of deals that has allowed particularly U.S. allies to take advantage of the United States. And really, the U.S. is paying costs and not really getting anything in return from those. Now, there's some debate over whether he's just simply transactional and he's willing to negotiate on all of these things. Ultimately, that's what it means to view everything in terms of deals. In some ways, even just by being transactional in his worldview. I mean, we've already moved from a world of positive sum gains where you can have positive sum cooperation to a world of deals, a world where you're making transactions and bargaining is already a world where the basis of the post-1945 international order has fundamentally shifted. We are just in a new world, and that is the mindset, I think, of President-elect Trump, and the mindset, I think, of many people around him who have articulated what an America First grand strategy would look like. And so the thing that is different is not the worldview. I think this worldview, has been pretty consistent. But I think we can expect that how the second Trump administration pursues U.S. foreign policy will be different than the first term, where in the first term, of course, he was constrained, I think, to some extent by a lack of preparedness, maybe surprised that he won in 2016, constrained by traditional Republican foreign policy leads who wound up in his administration, the quote-unquote guardrails that surrounded him, and just, I think, a sense of maybe competing priorities that made it hard to really follow through on some of the things he wanted to do. I think it seems safe to say that he will be less constrained in pursuing an America First foreign policy, that his administration will be staffed by officials who are fully committed to his vision and loyal to him personally. I think he is coming in with plans now to weaken the ability of the civil and foreign services, the intelligence community, and the military to oppose the shift, because I think institutionally all of these parts of the U.S. government are committed to the bipartisan internationalist foreign policy. And I think we can also say that politically he will feel emboldened by his electoral victory, both since he won the Electoral College and the popular vote, and also that he, of course, overcame a number of legal challenges to win the presidency. So I think he's going to feel more confident. I think he's going to feel stronger. And it's going to just be a different kind of administration. Now, we shouldn't assume that he's necessarily going to be able to get everything he wants. There's going to be differences of opinion. There are essentially different factions within the GOP, within the Republican Party, different thinking about how to conduct foreign policy, whether it should be purely isolationist. I think there are people who you might want to call it isolationist. I think there are people who maybe think just focusing exclusively on China and maybe even abandoning Europe to focus on countering China, I think is one possibility. So there are different schools of thought. There'll be some maybe debate within the administration about how to prioritize and which goals to take. So we can't say with 100% certainty what exactly the policy is going to look like. But fundamentally, the mindset is going to be different. The way of thinking is going to be different. And therefore, the range of potential outcomes for Japan in this situation is significantly greater and different than with preceding U.S. administrations. I think all of those things I think we should expect to be the case. Now, for Japan, when we think about what some of those scenarios might look like, I think there are some things that we can say with some confidence, but there still is, I think, a lot of room for different outcomes. The first outcome really to probably consider and to think about is this scenario that ultimately it ends up looking a lot like the first term in terms of maybe thinking about it as during the first term, there were a number of course, China hawks in the Trump administration. And I think as a result of that, there was, I think, an appreciation within the Trump administration that to have an effective policy of countering China, ultimately a strong alliance, a strong relationship with Japan is essential. And that, as a result, could insulate Japan from some pressure on trade concessions. It could maybe insulate Japan from some more outsized demands, whether for host nation support or to raise defense spending. Doesn't mean there won't be any of these demands, but it's possible and maybe even likely that because of the importance of countering China for people around Trump, that and for Trump himself, that that the Trump administration will ultimately look to Japan as a partner, will see the alliance as beneficial for the United States. And I think that's the important thing to recognize. They're going to see cooperation with Japan not for the benefits that it provides for Japan's security or for Japan's national interest, but what it means for the United States and its ability to counter China, to contain China, if we want to put it that way. And therefore, there's really room for Japan to make itself useful to the United States. And that really is the mindset, perhaps, that the Japanese government needs to approach this, that the United States and U.S. policymakers during the second Trump administration are going to be thinking in terms of is this cooperation, is this relationship, is it useful for U.S. national interests? That there can't be this assumption of the kind of cooperation that we saw under the Biden administration and between Biden and Kishida, where this focus on the global partnership and all the things that the U.S. and Japan were doing together to provide global public goods. I don't think that messaging, I don't think that approach is going to be how the second Trump administration thinks about Japan as a partner. It is really going to be, the United States could lose if China is stronger, if it becomes a hegemon in the region, and therefore Japan has to position itself as indispensable for the U.S. to meet its goals to fend off that challenge. And actually, as a representative, or I think a good illustration of this way of thinking actually can be found in some remarks that the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, said at an event at the Center for Strategic International Studies back in September. I think this quote actually perfectly captures how some of the China hawks in the Trump administration are going to think about Asia and then think about cooperation with Japan in that context. So at this event, Congressman Waltz said 50% of global GDP is sitting in that area, referring to Asia. And if China manages to control or coerce that GDP, that's a huge step towards Xi's stated goal of replacing the United States as a global leader. So the goal will be, the U.S. has a lot to lose if China establishes a hegemony over the region, and therefore the U.S. will look to Japan as an indispensable partner. But I think coming with that, even if second Trump administration officials see Japan's value and maybe even in its indispensability, they're still going to be looking to implement Trump's views about allies contributing more. They're still going to be looking to correct fix what they see as the perception that the relationships are unfair, that they rest on fundamentally bad deals made by previous U.S. administrations. And so I think there's every reason for Tokyo to expect that there will be greater demands to contribute more towards hosting U.S. forces in Japan. There may be demands for further trade negotiations, picking up the bilateral FTA talks from the first Trump administration and maybe open its market to more U.S. goods and service exports. There may be demands to reduce its economic engagement with China, which I realize could be an uncomfortable demand in some ways, depending on what those demands look like in particular. Or as Elbridge Colby, who of course was a Defense Department official in the first Trump administration, has argued that Japan needs to raise its defense spending to maybe at least 3% of GDP instead of just 2% of GDP. In other words, the cost of preserving the U.S. commitment to Japan's security will likely be higher in an America First era. And other U.S. allies in the region, as well as Taiwan, will have to make similar calculations about their security relationships with the United States. So this is probably the most realistic scenario, that there's still U.S. commitment to Asia, there's still a U.S. commitment to regional security because it's in the interest of the United States, because the United States will ultimately want to prevent Chinese hegemony in the region, but the cost for U.S. allies could be higher. And depending on what Japan and other allies are willing to put up, there may be questions about the reliability of the U.S. security commitment. There may still need to be more discussion among U.S. allies about how they can help each other shore up deterrence, what they need to do to defend themselves in the event that there are questions about U.S. security guarantees. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, But depending on how bilateral negotiations go, there could still be some room for doubt. I do want to touch briefly on some of the other possible scenarios, which maybe are less likely, but because just based on the kinds of remarks that we've heard from the president-elect and others around him, they are certainly plausible scenarios, and they need to be considered as well. I think first, what I call on this slide the deal maker scenario. Trump, as we've seen, is clearly comfortable negotiating, talking, bargaining with with other strongmen. That the kind of talks that we saw with North Korea, the kind of talks that we saw with China, the relationship with Russia and with Putin. There's certainly, I think, a possibility that we see essentially the United States move more into an era of almost dividing up spheres of influence with other great powers, and that's the predominant approach. Is this the most likely approach? Maybe not, but it is certainly, I think, there is a potential for it, and certainly a greater potential with a president like Trump, who, again, is not as committed to the positive sum post-war institutions and does view the world transactionally and is looking to get the best possible deal for the United States, that he may see the best deals will come from working with other great powers, even authoritarian great powers, rather than with U.S. allies. And certainly he said things on the campaign trail to suggest that he views U.S. allies as more irritating to negotiate with than some of the authoritarian strongmen. So that's a possibility, and it's something that I think what we saw, if we use Trump's negotiations with Kim Jong-un during his first term as something of a case study, it's something where there may be relatively limited leverage for countries like Japan over the outcome of those negotiations. Of course, we saw then Prime Minister Abe, repeatedly called Trump, trying to get him to take Japan's interest into consideration in those negotiations with Kim Jong-un. I'm not sure how much influence Abe had on Trump himself. I think there may have been people in the administration who were receptive to Abe's message and were willing to work essentially with Japan to advance Japan's perspective and ensure that Japan was considered ultimately in North Korea policymaking. But it's not going to be like that this time around. I mean, I think there aren't going to be the same potential partners within the Trump administration who will necessarily be pushing that if Trump decides that is the course of action that he wants to take. Again, it's hard to say what exactly the probability of this scenario is, but it also cannot be ruled out as a possibility. And I think that is something that Japan and other U.S. allies have to be prepared for. And there's every reason for U.S. allies, particularly in Asia, to really continue talking amongst themselves, to really deepening their bilateral and minilateral trade and security relationships in preparation for the possibility that you might see this sort of grand bargain between the U.S. and other great powers. Another scenario, and this one is not necessarily mutually exclusive with some of the other ones, is that you end up with a second Trump administration that is actually distracted by its domestic agenda. And that would mean that, if we look at the actual numbers, Trump has tried to claim an overwhelming mandate. But of course, it appears when all votes are counted that he'll have won a very narrow electoral victory, one of the most narrow in quite a long time. He's going to have a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives, a very narrow majority in the Senate. And so there's potential, depending on what he does, that Congress could push back. And of course, we're going to see a test with some of the appointments he has made for his cabinet. But of course, some of his policies could actually result also in domestic pushback. I think mass deportations, we've already seen Democratic governors say that they're not going to cooperate with the administration and would find ways of resisting if Trump tried to use National Guard troops from other states to round up migrants in Democratic governed states. That's going to cause major distraction. We might see large protests. There could be violent protests. All of that is very much possible. And depending on also what happens with the performance of the U.S. economy, particularly with the tariffs that the administration is planning to introduce early on, the potential for domestic opposition, domestic pushback it's a very live possibility. And what that means for the ability of the United States, particularly if you have crises overseas, to respond to those crises, is going to be in question depending on what is happening with domestic politics in the United States, and that's something else that's worth considering as well. I do want to take a little time in the time I have remaining, just thinking about how Japan might approach the second Trump administration, and both the lessons that maybe can be learned from how the late Abe Shinzo dealt with President Trump, but also maybe some of the lessons that are not applicable this time around. I in general am skeptical that the right approach for Japan is to try to repeat essentially the Abe playbook from the first time around. And I think there's two reasons why I don't necessarily think that will work this time. First of all, I think at the start of the first Trump administration, you had a president who perhaps was surprised to find himself as president and was not necessarily ready for the job, and I think appreciated Abe's willingness to meet with him quickly and early on, and to treat him, he was the victorious president, and I think that gave Abe, I think, a lot of credit, and I think was the basis for a solid relationship that lasted throughout Trump's term. But it is also worth considering that I think as Trump got more confident during his first term, that there were diminishing returns to that personal relationship. So that while it helped, I think, in maybe 2017 to ensure that the United States and Japan were cooperating as North Korea launched a series, its escalating series of missile tests, as I think it helped Japan push back on demands for a bilateral FTA and delay those demands for some time. By 2018 and by 2019, I don't know if that personal relationship was having the same impact. I think that you were seeing diminishing returns, of course, with Trump's diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, as well as with on the trade front, where Trump, of course, threatened to impose auto tariffs on Japan if Japan did not come to the table on a bilateral FTA. So it's important not to overlearn the lessons of Abe's personal diplomacy with Trump. And so therefore we shouldn't expect that the right answer for Japan at this moment of time is for Ishiba to forge that similar kind of personal relationship with Trump. That if he does that, it will solve whatever issues might come up in the bilateral relationship with the United States. That ultimately is not necessarily going to be the right approach. And in that sense, it might not necessarily be a bad thing that Ishiba will not meet with Trump before he is inaugurated in January. I think some of another reason why it's not going to be the same as 2016, 2017, of course, is that Ishiba is not the same kind of leader as Abe was. I mean, Abe, of course, in 2016 was probably as strong as he was at any point during his second administration. He had a stable government at home. His approval ratings were strong, majorities, solid majorities in both houses of the Diet. And of course, at that point, he had had years of being on the global stage and being a global statesman. And Ishiba, of course, is very new to the premiership, does not have those years of experience as conducting personal diplomacy as Japan's leader, and of course, after last month's election, also does not have a majority in the lower house, importantly, and of course, also has less public support as well. And so he is in a more difficult position than Abe was. He has, I think, a more difficult hand to play, that he has, I think, maybe less leverage at the negotiating table. I think that any of the concessions that you might get from the United States on trade, on security, host nation support, on Japanese defense spending, it will be harder to, it'll be simultaneously harder for Ishiba to say no because of his, because of fears that you might lose the U.S. commitment to Japan's security, but it also may be harder for Ishiba to implement those demands as well. That it is, of course, I think it's been difficult enough figuring out how to get defense spending to 2% of GDP and how to pay for it, and getting to 3% of GDP will be extraordinarily difficult. So, in light of these constraints, I think it is important to not risk everything on personal diplomacy, and I think it is important to maybe prepare to be somewhat reactive, to be, to wait to see what Trump actually does, what he says, what the asks from the United States government are, and then be prepared to respond to those, but not be too eager to go and forge a personal relationship. There's no reason, of course, Japan should maybe not do what some European leaders have done, where they have domestic incentives to perhaps be more defiant, to show that they're opposing Trump and vocally criticizing Trump. I don't think there's anything to be gained, of course, from Ishiba doing that, but there also shouldn't be an overinvestment in the personal relationship. I think what there should be an investment in, and I think there already has been from the Japanese government through the embassy in Tokyo, or in Washington rather, that there should be an investment in relationships with Republicans in Congress. There should be an investment in relationships with the kinds of Republicans who will be in different places in the administration. And I think all of that has happened. And those relationships will be very important in just ensuring that there's understanding in Washington of what Japan can realistically do in response to some of the demands that are likely to come from the Trump administration. And so that, I think, in some ways, perhaps bunkering down a little bit, being a little more defensive, preparing for some of the demands that might come is perhaps a better strategy, trying to keep Japan's head down perhaps and hope that the attention is on other U.S. allies and other problems may be the wisest strategy at this point. Of course, the other thing, and this, of course, happened during the during Abe's government during the first Trump administration, and that is that Japan, even as it is focused on the United States and trying to keep the United States engaged in the region, because the alternatives to that are still unpalatable, even if a Make America Great foreign policy is harder to deal with. That Japan should continue its relationship building with partners in the region. It should continue to invest in closer ties with Europe. It should continue to find ways to stabilize relations with China. And I think that already has happened over the last several months and really ought to continue, because ultimately Japan has an interest in a stable international order, and it needs to find any partners that it can find to support that. And so, of course, it shouldn't work adversarially to the United States as it pursues these goals, but it needs to work on both tracks. Finding ways to work with the United States to satisfy the United States' demands for a more equitable partnership, but then not be isolated in the region. Continue to find ways of building relationships in the region, and just be ready to adapt. Just as a word of closing, I think it is worth remembering as we head into a more uncertain period. That, of course, there's going to be a lot of focus on the relationships between the two governments and how who's in what administration and what sort of relationships they have and how they're working together. But ultimately, there is still a strong relationship between the two peoples, between the two business communities, and that engagement is likely to continue and should continue, and efforts to strengthen those relationships, to strengthen Japanese FDI into the United States and encourage more U.S. investment in Japan as well, all of that should be encouraged. because ultimately, even if the President of the United States does not believe in positive sum cooperation, I think universally, I think among both the American and the Japanese people, I think there's a universal recognition that cooperation between our peoples has its value for its own sake, and that in fact this era may in fact create new opportunities for cooperation between peoples, between businesses, between universities, and all of those efforts should continue to be supported by well-meaning people on both sides of the Pacific. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you for having me.